Hi, everyone. This is the Chapter 7 overview. And Chapter 7 is the chapter that focuses on attitudes, behavior, and rationalization. I want us to think about our attitudes and what are attitudes? Well, attitudes are how we um, how we evaluate a let me start with this how we evaluate an object or a social environment, either in a positive or negative way. And there are three factors that go into the creation of our attitudes. And so one is affect, or how we feel about an object or a social environment or a person. Another is cognition. How do we feel, how do we think about that social environment or that object or that person? And then third is behavior. So what do we do? How do we act after we perceive the situation? And attitudes are often measured by what is known as the Likert scale. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Likert scale. It's the surveys that we've all done, rate from 0 to 10, with 0 being that you don't like it and 10 being that you like it the most, or 1 to 5, etc. And so it's a scale that's really used to just try to get us to think about, well, do I really like something or do I really dislike something, or strongly agree versus strongly disagree, and then everything in between. Those are very common Likert scales that I'm sure you've all seen. Um, and a response latency is how long does it take a person to respond to a stimulus? So, for example, or a question, or the social environment. So, for example, if you're at work and a coworker of yours comes into your office and says, "Oh, hey, how's it going today?" And you say, "Fine." Person says, "Hey, by the way, how do you like my new outfit?" Or "How do you like my new hairstyle?" Or "How do you like this new phone?" Or something. If you pause for a moment before you answer, um, that is an indicator that you are really thinking about your response uh, in such a way that you don't want to give the wrong response, or a response that is offensive. Versus, kids are famous for doing this. They can tell you their attitude about things without even being asked. They just blurt it out. They're incredibly honest, children, and those of you who have children, you know that. Um, then I think I don't, maybe I haven't talked much about this before, but there's Harvard University has created this whole research center. It's called the Implicit Project. And they have created a series of IATs, or what we call implicit association tests, that try to tap into the subconscious attitudes of people, that study, things such as our facial and body expressions, the use of physical proximity and our physiological responses. Um, of course, there's some criticism of these things, and I think you guys have done a blog or discussion on this. But here's what we know for sure. We know for sure that attitudes are often inconsistent with our behavior. That is, we will say one thing, but we do something else. And I don't know about you, but I had a mom who would say, don't do that. And then she'd turn around and do that same thing she told us not to do. Or do this. And then she'd turn around and not do the thing she told us to do. And so that is quite common, where we will say one thing or say that we believe in this thing, or that we feel this way about something. And then what we do is not consistent with what we have said our attitude is. And so what we do know is that our attitudes are influenced by our social norms, the social norms around us, and also situational factors. That is, depending upon the social environment we're in, might we do one thing, but then do something different, even though we say our attitude is the same. So here's a perfect example of this. Um, a lot of people will say that cheating is wrong. They say, my attitude about cheating is that I believe it's wrong. It's wrong. However, cheating is much more frequent than probably any of you imagine. Now, if most people say that cheating is wrong, and yet many people cheat, on taxes or tests, or even in relationships, then clearly their attitude is not consistent with their behavior. Okay. And so, one of the things that we're going to look at in this chapter is which comes first, the behavior and then the formation of the attitude, or the attitude and then the formation of the behavior. So, it is an interesting question, and maybe the answer is one for certain things and the other for other things. Um, so, how do we measure attitudes? Well, certainly what people say gives us an indication. Um, However, also, we do know that there are nonverbal measures. So, how close we are to somebody, our facial expressions, whether we touch someone or hug someone, etc. For example, you may say that you like your in-laws, but while you say that you have that attitude, what do you do around them? Does your behavior really match your attitude? That's a question. Not just for those people who are married, but also just for, we all, if you have a partner, there's a family that comes along with that. Um, there can be physiological measures as well. So maybe an increased heart rate, or we get sweaty palms, or we start sweating under our underarms. That may also tell us what our attitude is. So there's a study that's cited in the text, and you see it listed here. It was done in the 1930s, but I think it's still relevant because what it tells us is that people often will say one thing and then do something different. Um, and so in this study, there was a Caucasian researcher who traveled across the United States with a Chinese couple. And during the 1930s, anti-Chinese sentiment was very high. And they were only denied service at one of the 250 places they visited. Um, However, when the researcher then contacted these places later, and unbeknownst to them, they did not know that this researcher had stayed there with the Chinese couple. 90% of them said they would not allow a Chinese couple to stay or Chinese people to stay at their establishment. Okay, which maybe is good news because that means that people who are racist, maybe while they hold racist sentiments or attitudes about various groups of people, maybe they don't actually discriminate when they get the opportunity. Maybe. I don't know if we can make that extrapolation, but it would be interesting if that were the case. And there's a video there about attitudes and biases you can watch on your own time. I want us to really focus on cognitive dissonance theory because it is one theory that is very, very well known in social psychology. And I'm sure as we go through this, you will recognize that you have experienced cognitive dissonance as well. We all have, I think. Cognitive dissonance theory is really focused on the idea that when we say we have an attitude and we've put it out there, in particular when we've put it out there and said to everybody, hey, this is my attitude about this. And then we are faced with behavior, we engage in behavior that is opposite what we said our attitude is. We feel some level of unsettled feelings. We don't like the feeling of that dissonance, of that disagreement between our attitude and our behavior. It makes us feel bad, we feel guilty, etc. And so cognitive dissonance theory argues that when that happens, that people will do one of two things. They will either change their attitude or they will change their behavior. And they will do that to restore the consistency between the attitude and the behavior. Okay? And I just, quickly, there are a couple of examples here. For example, if you think about smoking, okay, there's no one, even smokers know that it is not a healthy practice. Okay, ask any smoker, they'll tell you, yeah, I know it's not healthy. I know this is going to kill me. And they might even say, yeah, I know I should quit, okay? Because it's bad for their health. However, while they know that, their attitude about smoking is generally still quite positive. Um, and so, how is it that they know that it's bad for their health and it's probably going to, in the long run, maybe kill them? How is it that they can still feel positively about smoking? Well, remember their behavior. They can do one of two things. They can either quit smoking, but a lot of people find it very difficult to do, and even those who do, uh, who are successful at quitting smoking, often try 5 or more times. And so rather than quit smoking, cognitive dissonance theory posits the idea that, well, then they will simply change the way that they think about smoking. So here are some examples there at the bottom. For example, I've heard people say some similar things to this. I know my grandfather smoked every day and he lived to be 100 years old. Or, yeah, I know it's bad for me, but it helps me relax. Or, my mother-in-law told me, I told her, you should really quit smoking. And she said, yeah, I know, but hey, you're going to die I'm going to die someday anyway. And, well, I won't tell you, well, I'm going to die anyway, so fuck it. And I'm going to die. Her attitude is, well, I don't really care. I don't really care that smoking's bad for me. Why? Because she doesn't want to change the behavior. So rather than focusing on the fact that it's bad for her, she focuses on the fact that, hey, everybody's going to die. I'm going to die. I don't care if I die this way. That is reducing the cognitive dissonance. Okay? Or just think about somebody who cheats on an exam. Maybe this person's always said, hey, cheating's wrong. I wouldn't do it. But in this one instance, maybe the person cheats. But maybe this person, because of the cognitive dissonance, hey, I've always said cheating's bad, and yet I cheated this time, or I'm going to cheat this time. Maybe this person then changes the attitude, not the behavior, but the attitude, and says, well, I know cheating's wrong, but in certain situations, maybe it's not so bad. And in this situation, I need to cheat because of X or Y or Z. Another layperson's term, we might think of it as being rationalization. Cognitive dissonance theory as well. Once we do something, our behavior can't be taken back, right? There's no quote do-over. Once we've made a decision and we've carried out that decision by our behavior, the cognitive dissonance may make us feel so badly that we either change the attitude or we could, of course, change the behavior. But for a lot of people, it's easier to rationalize their behavior than it is to change the behavior. And so you probably can think of some instances in which you have experienced cognitive dissonance and you've changed the attitude rather than the behavior. Okay, and there's a little quick think there that I would have had you do. Effort justification. This idea is that we tend to reduce that cognitive dissonance that we're feeling by justifying either the time or the effort or the money that we devoted to doing something that turned out to be unpleasant or disappointing. Okay. Which means that, let's say that you spent a lot of money on a new car. You've been lusting after that luxury car, and you finally get the down payment together and you get the car. And you find after, a month or so that you're really not any happier than when you were driving the regular schmo car you had. But now effort justification says, now you feel badly about the fact that you spent all this money for a down payment on this car, that it really hasn't made you any happier. And so now you've got to justify that all that money you put down on the car. So rather than turn the car back in, which might tell everybody that you were wrong, you change your attitude about it and you rationalize your behavior. Like it was a great purchase. Yeah, I had to put a lot of money down, and yeah, I've got to put this super premium gas in it, but you know what? It's such a comfortable ride, or it's such a safe car. In some way, you justify your purchase of this expensive car, even though maybe in your heart of hearts you recognize maybe this wasn't the best buy. but you don't want other people to know that. So you've got to justify your behavior. Um, some other examples here. For example, fraternity hazings. This is a great example. Fraternity hazings are off, there have been many instances where there are quite severe initiations, and even though people may go through shit to become a member of a fraternity, they often look back on that period of the initiation as with fondness. Oh, I made some great friends during the process, and oh, it was a time in my life when I was young, and this, that, and the other. So they may look back fondly on that initiation period when they were being hazed with some degree of fondness. Even think about the sweet lemons rationalization listed there. And that, if we spend a lot of money on a vacation and the resort's just so, or laying on the beach for a week isn't all that we thought it would be, we may come back from the vacation and people may ask us, oh, how was that, week on the beach in Dominican Republic or wherever it was? Um, because we spent money on it, we talked about it so positively before, we may feel as though, well, I've got to put the positive spin on this because I don't really want people to know that it wasn't all as great as I thought it was going to be. Um, so there's also this idea of when we are forced to do something, then it's less likely that we will experience cognitive dissonance because we didn't have a choice in the matter. So, if we think that cheating's wrong, and yet our boss comes and tells us, hey, fudge the numbers on that invoice a little bit, we might do it, but we may not feel bad about it because we didn't have a choice. We were told to cheat on that invoice or on that form or whatever it might be. And so, again, you think about, if there's free will here, we tend to feel much worse about the cognitive dissonance between our behavior and our attitude versus if somebody's telling us to do it. Let's see, I can read about that. Okay, so I want I want to focus a little bit on this idea of, if there are negative consequences, whether or not there are negative consequences to our behavior, sometimes does influence whether or not there's cognitive dissonance. So there's an example given there that is very, very common. Um, many of us would probably disagree with the idea that lying's wrong. We shouldn't lie if we can avoid it. However, we also have a concept in this country that we say, telling, quote, little white lies is not that bad, right? And so honesty supposedly is the best policy, but think about how often we tell those, quote, little white lies. A coworker who says to you, hey, what did you think of my speech this morning, my presentation? Maybe you thought it sucked, but you don't want to hurt that person's feelings, so you say, oh, I thought it was good. We call it a little white lie. Do you feel bad about it? Probably not. Why? Because you tell yourself, well, nothing really terrible happened as a result of my lying, telling that small lie. There's no negative consequence. And I didn't hurt that person's feelings. Therefore, my telling that lie is not such a big deal. Or maybe you go to someone's house for, a meal, dinner. They invite you to a barbecue, whatever. And what happens? Well, maybe there's a dessert there or a dish there that the host says, "Oh, you got to try this. It's my family's secret recipe, and it's the dish that I make the best." And you try it, and you're, hey, so what? What do you think? What do you think? And maybe you don't like it. Maybe you think it tastes nasty, too much salt or whatever. But again, you're at someone's house, and so maybe you say, "Oh man, this is great. Gosh, you got to get me the recipe. This is oh wait, family recipe. You probably can't give it to me, but man, this is to die for." You don't feel bad about that. Why? Because even though you believe that telling a lie is wrong, in this instance, there's nothing negative really that comes out of lying, unless this person keeps making it for you every time you come over, and that could actually happen. All right, so foreseeability, that's another thing. We may not feel badly if our behavior results in some sort of negative consequence that we couldn't even foresee, right? So, for example, if you ask a friend to pick you up from the airport and your friend gets to a little fender bender on the way, you probably don't feel that bad about it because you couldn't have foreseen the accident. So, you just ask your friend for a favor. It's not like you asked your friend for a favor knowing that that person was going to get into an accident. So if we couldn't foresee the negative consequence of our behavior, then we typically don't feel bad about it. And there's the one here about the food allergy, or at work we say something and it gets somebody else in trouble. We didn't realize that it was going to get somebody else in trouble. We maybe don't feel as bad as if we had done it on purpose. Um, One thing about the cognitive dissonance idea is, excuse me, one thing about cognitive dissonance is that the higher our self-esteem, the less likely we feel the need to rationalize our decisions or our behavior. And so, for example, if you are somebody who has a fairly high level um, of self-esteem, and you say to people, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to start meditating every day during lunch because I think meditating is good for me." Your attitude is, "My meditation is good for me," so you say, "My behavior is going to be that I'm going to meditate during my lunch hour every day." Well, let's say after a week, you're not doing this anymore. And so some people are going to lunch the following week and they say, "Hey, we're going to lunch, but we know you got to meditate. So we would invite you, but we know you're meditating now." And you say, "No, no, I'll go." And they say, "Well, what happened to meditating?" And you say, "I don't need to meditate every day. A few times a week is good enough." You don't feel bad about what you said. Meditation's good. I'm going to do it every day. To your behavior, which is, okay, I don't need to do it every day. I can go to lunch with a group of people from work. You don't feel bad about that because you have high self-esteem. You don't care that other people might think, "Well, geez, that didn't last very long." On the other hand, if you have low self-esteem and people kind of, jab at you a little bit at lunch, like, "Hey, whatever happened to that? You were going to do it every day." If you have low self-esteem, it probably gets to you. And maybe you do go back to trying to meditate every day during lunchtime. But if you're somebody with high self-esteem, it doesn't bother you. In fact, you joke about it too. You let the jokes just roll off of you, and you joke about it too, and you don't feel bad about it. This theory, self-perception theory, is really interesting. And that's because, unlike cognitive dissonance theory, it posits that we actually perceive our attitudes after we act. So think about that. Cognitive behavior, cognitive dissonance theory, and it's here in this slide. Cognitive dissonance theory makes the argument that people change their attitudes to fit their behavior whenever there are inconsistencies that make them uncomfortable or unpleasant. They have unpleasant feelings about it. On the other hand, self-perception theory makes this argument that you don't need to have an unpleasant mental state to develop attitudes. In fact, self-perception theory argues that we don't change our attitudes. Rather, what happens is that we act, or we do something, we behave in a particular situation, and then we infer our attitudes from our behavior. So, for example, the example here is, I told them the task was fun, so it must have been fun because there wasn't any other reason to say it was. Or consider this. You go to a work party, and then on that Monday, others say, "Hey, how'd you like the party?" And you say, "I had a really good time. It was fun." And so your attitude is positive because of what your experience, not that your attitude was, "I'm going to have a good time," and then you didn't have a good time. So now you have cognitive dissonance. It's really turning on its head cognitive dissonance theory. So how do we reconcile these two different ideas? Well, many researchers argue that cognitive dissonance is much more likely to occur when behavior doesn't fit a pre-existing attitude. And that attitude is important to our self-concept. Um, so here's an example of that. Let's say there's somebody who is a practicing Catholic who believes very strongly that in the teachings of the Catholic Church. And one of the teachings of the Catholic Church is that premarital sex is wrong and you shouldn't do it. Well, what if this person has a relationship, a long-term relationship, and eventually does have premarital sex with the partner? Because that attitude, that premarital sex is wrong, is so deeply held, cognitive dissonance is very likely to occur, such that the person begins to feel very badly about the fact that, hey, I had this very strong attitude. It's really important to me. And yet I went ahead and had premarital sex. In order to reconcile the two, one of two things has to happen. Either the attitude is going to change or the behavior is going to change. If the attitude changes, then maybe this person says, well, I know that the Catholic Church says this, but, this is a loving relationship. It feels right, blah, 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 blah. Maybe the behavior changes. Maybe this person says to the partner, you know what? I believe really strongly that premarital sex is wrong. I can't do that with you again. I feel very strongly about this. Okay, maybe the behavior changes, or maybe the attitude changes. But cognitive dissonance theory says one of those two things is going to happen. Self-perception theory, on the other hand, is researchers argue, is probably more relevant when we're talking about or thinking about attitudes that are weak or even ambiguous. So if you don't have a really strong prior attitude, and you do something like, maybe generally you think, well, just having one night stands is wrong. Okay, but it's not a really strongly held attitude, and you're not somebody who goes around willy-nilly having one night stands one way or the other. But then you do have a one night stand, say, or the individual has a one night stand. Because that attitude that one night stands are bad or not such a great idea, if the person has a one night stand, the person's not going to experience any really strong negative feelings or any kind of mental distress because he or she had the one night stand. Because the thinking about the one night stand was, well, that's probably not a good idea. I probably wouldn't do it. But if you do it, because you didn't have a really strong attitude, you're not going to feel that badly about it. So that's how both of those ideas, the self-perception theory and the cognitive dissonance theory, can actually work in tandem to explain our attitudes and our behaviors. Let's see. This is also a really interesting idea, system justification theory. It helps, I think, to explain some of what is going on right now across various states in the nation. System justification theory is this idea that people who are motivated to view the existing socio-political system as fair, as legitimate, as equitable, they're much more likely to promote the status quo. So, for example, if they're looking at a homeless person, they're much more likely to think, well, I could go to school, I went out and got a job, I work hard every day, and homeless people could do the same thing. They're just lazy and they won't do it. The system as it is fair. Everybody has an opportunity to get an education, to get a job, to move up in the world. They may also believe in stereotypes, or they may justify inequities in society with an example like the one there. Sure, women make less money than for the same job, but they're better liked at work, or they're not asked to do as much, or they take more time off from work, or they go on family leave so they can have children. So yeah, it makes sense for them not to get paid as much. So somebody who looks at the world and analyzes the world through that system justification, that is, the world is just, it's equitable, everybody has an equal opportunity, they're much more likely to have attitudes that are negative toward people or groups who aren't like them. And terror management theory is another really interesting idea. Terror management theory essentially is saying this: look, we all know we're going to die. We all know we have mortality, right? We all know that it's going to end for all of us. We don't know when. But if we allowed ourselves to think about that every single day when we wake up, if we allowed ourselves to think, oh my gosh, I might die today. I might die in the next hour, or I might die tomorrow, or I might die next week. Oh my gosh, we wouldn't get anything done. We would be stricken with fear to the extent that we wouldn't even want to leave our houses because we'd be so afraid of anything I do out there I'm gonna die. Hell, we might not even want to eat because, hey, what if I choke to death? And I live alone, and what if I choke to death? And so, how do we deal with this? Well, terror management theory says, well, what happens is we try to live through what theorists call symbolic immortality, meaning that we try to view ourselves as much more connected to the broader world around us, to our culture, the groups, the people around us, the social institutions that we're part of. And so people tend to have a much stronger identification with things like our families, our country, our religion, maybe even a club or a group that we belong to, because we want to leave a legacy. In fact, I think that's sometimes why early on people were encouraged, if you get married, you should have children. Why would you get married and not have children? You got to leave a legacy. You got to leave, people to carry on your name, etc. Um, on the other hand, there are many people today who don't necessarily feel as though they have to have children in order to leave a legacy. Not that having children is bad, it's just the case that not everybody feels the need to have them anymore, as though that proves your worth, your worthiness to even be living. We also, as a result of being more aware of our mortality, salience is something that it becomes more important. So the more aware we become of our own mortality, the more we often become committed to our group, what we call the in group. And we may become more hostile to out groups or people that we view as very different from us, or even challenging in a negative way our existence or our group. And so there often is increased hostility to people who either criticize the country or who practice even a different religion from ourselves, etc. So being aware of our mortality, it seems, can actually make us less tolerant and accepting of others than if we focus less on it. If we focus less on our own mortality, it seems that we may be actually more open to others and less judgmental of those others. So that is a good overview of Chapter 7. I encourage you to take a look at the links and the videos that I've put in the various slides to highlight some of the material. So at this point, I will say goodbye until the next chapter.